Hi, I'm Wendy, and I'm here with New Deal Creative Arts Stories at 7. We are reading The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And today, we are on Chapter 8, The Robin Who Showed the Way. She looked at the key quite a long time. She turned it over and over, and she thought about it. By the way, here is the picture at the top of the chapter showing you-know-who, the robin. As I have said before, she was not a child who had been trained to ask permission or consult her elders about things. All she thought about was the key, was that if it was the key to the closed garden and she could find out where the door was, she could perhaps open it and see what was inside the walls and what had happened to the old rose trees. It was because it had been shut up so long that she wanted to see it. It seemed as if it must be different from other places and that something strange must have happened to it during 10 years. Besides that, if she liked it, she could go into it every day and shut the door behind her. And she could make up some play of her own and play it quite alone because nobody would ever know where she was, but would think the door was still locked and the key buried in the earth. The thought of that pleased her very much. Living, as it were, all by herself in a house with 100 mysteriously closed rooms and having nothing whatever to do to amuse herself had set her inactive brain to work and was actually awakening her imagination. There is no doubt that the fresh, strong, pure air of the moor had had a great deal to do with this. Just as it had given her an appetite, and fighting with the wind had stirred her blood, so the same things had stirred her mind. Already she felt less contrary, though she did not know why. She put the key in her pocket and walked up and down her walk. No one but herself ever seemed to come there, so she could walk slowly and look at the wall, or rather at the ivy growing on it. The ivy was the baffling thing. Howsoever carefully she looked, she could see nothing but thickly growing, glossy, dark green leaves. She was very much disappointed. Something of her contrariness came back to her as she paced the wall and looked over it at the treetops inside. It seemed so silly, she said to herself, to be near it and not to be able to get in. She took the key in her pocket when she went back to the house, and she made up her mind that she would always carry it with her when she went out, so if she should ever find the hidden door, she would be ready. Mrs. Medlock had allowed Martha to sleep all night at the cottage, but she was back at her work in the morning with cheeks redder than ever and in the best of spirits. "I got up at 4 o'clock, she said. 'Twas pretty on the moor with the birds getting up and the rabbits scampering about and the sun rising. I didn't walk all the way. A man gave me a ride in his cart, and I can tell you I did enjoy myself." She was full of stories of the delights of her day out. Her mother had been glad to see her, and they had got the baking and washing all out of the way. She had even made each of the children a dough cake with a bit of brown sugar in it. "I had 'em all piping hot when they came in from playing on the moor, and the cottage all smelt so nice and clean with hot bacon, and there was a good fire, and they just shouted for joy. Our Dickon, he said our cottage was good enough for a king to live in." In the evening they had all sat around the fire, and Martha and her mother had sewed patches on torn clothes and mended stockings, and Martha had told them about the little girl who had come from India, who had been waited on, and didn't know how to put on her own shoes and stockings. They did like to hear about you," said Martha. "They wanted to know all about the people who lived there and what kind of ship you came in. I couldn't tell them enough." Mary reflected a little. "I'll tell you a great deal more before your next day out," she said, "so that you will have more stories to tell when you go home. I dare say they would like to hear all about riding on elephants and about people going out to hunt tigers." "My word," cried Martha, "it would set 'em clean off their heads. Would they really do that, miss? It would be the same as like going to a show like we heard about in York once." "India is quite different from York," said Mary slowly as she thought the matter over. "I never thought of that. Did Dickon and your mother like to hear you talking about me?" "Why, our Dickon's eyes nearly started out of his head, they got that round," answered Martha. "But mother, she was put out about your seeming to be all by yourself like. She said, 'Hasn't Mr. Craven got no governess for her, nor no nurse?' I said, 'No, she hasn't, though Mrs. Medlock says he will when he thinks of it, but he mayn't think of it for 2 or 3 years. "'I don't want a governess,' said Mary sharply. "'But mother says you ought to be learning your book by this time, and you ought to have a woman to look after you, and she says, "Now, Martha, you just think how you'd feel yourself in a big place like that, wandering about alone and no mother. You do your best to cheer her up," she says, and I said I would." Mary gave her a long, steady look. "You do cheer me up," she said. I like to hear you talk. Presently Martha went out of the room and came back with something held in her hands under her apron. "What is the think?" she said with a cheerful grin. "I've brought thee a present." "A present?" exclaimed Mistress Mary. How could a cottage full of 14 hungry people give anyone a present? "A man was driving across the moor peddling." Peddling means selling, Martha explained. "And he stopped his cart at our door. Just as he was going away, our Lisbeth Ellen called out, 'Mother, he's got skipping ropes with red and blue handles. And mother,' she calls out quite sudden, 'Here stop, mister, how much are they?' And he says, 'Tuppence,' which means 2 pennies. And mother, she begun fumbling in her pocket, and he says to me, 'Martha, thou's brought the wages like a good lass, and I've got 4 places to put every penny, but I'm just going to take 2pence out of it to buy that child a skipping rope,' and she bought one, and here it is." She brought it out from under her apron and exhibited it quite proudly. It was a long, slender rope with a striped red and blue handle at each end, but Mary Lennox had never seen a skipping rope before. She gazed at it with a mystified expression. "What is it for?" she asked. "For?" cried out Martha. "Does that mean they've not got skipping ropes in India, for all they've got elephants and tigers and camels? No wonder. This is just what it's for. Now you watch me." And she ran into the middle of the room, and taking a handle in each hand, she began to skip and skip and skip, while Mary turned in the chair to stare at her. And the queer faces in the old portraits seemed to stare at her too, and wonder what on earth this common little girl had the impudence to be doing under their noses. But Martha did not see them. The interest and curiosity in Mistress Mary's face delighted her, and she went on skipping and counting as she skipped until she had reached 100. "I could skip longer than that," she said when she stopped. "I've skipped as much as 500 when I was 12, but I'm bigger now, and I was much more in practice then." Mary got up from her chair, beginning to feel excited. "It looks nice," she said. "Your mother is a kind woman. Do you think I could ever skip like that?" "You just try it," urged Martha, handing her the skipping rope. "You can't skip 100 at first, but if you practice, you'll get there. That's what Mother said. She said nothing'll do her more good than a skipping rope. It's the most sensible toy a child can have. Let her play out in the fresh air and skipping, and it'll stretch her legs and arms and give her some real strength." It was plain that there was not a great deal of strength in Mistress Mary's arms and legs when she first began to skip. She was not very clever at it, but she liked it so much that she did not want to stop. "Put on the things and run and skip out of doors," said Martha. "Mother said I must tell you to keep out of doors as much as you could, even when it rains a bit, so as to wrap up warm." Mary put on her coat and hat and took her skipping rope over her arm. She opened the door to go out, and then suddenly thought of something and turned back rather slowly. "Martha," she said, "they were your wages. That was your 2pence, really." "Thank you." She said it stiffly, because she was not used to saying thank you to people, or noticing if they did something for her. "Thank you," she said, and held out her hand, because she did not know what else to do. Martha gave her hand a clumsy little shake, as if she was not accustomed to this sort of thing either. Then she laughed. "Thou art a queer old womanish thing," she said. "If there'd been our Lisbeth Ellen, I'd have given thee a kiss." Mary looked stiffer than ever. "Do you want me to kiss you?" Martha laughed again. "Hey, not me," she answered. "If there was different, perhaps, that want to thyself. But that isn't. Run off now and play with thy rope." Mistress Mary felt a little awkward as she went out of the room. Yorkshire people seemed strange, and Martha was always rather a puzzle to her. At first she had disliked her very much, but now she did not. The skipping rope was a wonderful thing. She counted and skipped and counted until her cheeks were quite red, and she was more interested than she had ever been since she was born. The sun was shining, and a little wind was blowing, not a rough wind, but one which came in delightful little gusts and brought a fresh scent of newly turned earth with it. She skipped round the fountain garden, and up one walk and down another. She skipped at last into the kitchen garden, and saw Ben Weatherstaff digging and talking to his robin, which was hopping about him. She skipped down the walk towards him, and he lifted his head and looked at her with a curious expression. She had wondered if he would notice her. She really wanted him to see her skip. "Well," he exclaimed, "upon my word, perhaps thou art a young un after all. Perhaps thou's got child's blood in thy veins instead of sour buttermilk. Thou skipped red into the cheeks as sure as my name's Ben Weatherstaff. I wouldn't have believed thou could do it." "I never skipped before," said Mary. "I'm just beginning. I can only go up to 20. Here is Mary talking to Ben. Here, you can look closely and see her skipping rope. And then you can see the robin is hanging out, and you can see Ben Weatherstaff. "The keep on," said Ben. "The shape's well enough at it for a young'un that's lived with people far away. Just see how he's watching thee," jerking his head towards the robin. "He followed after thee yesterday. He'll be at it again today. He'll be bound to find out what the skipping rope is all about. He's never seen one. Shaking his head at the bird, "the curiosity will be the death of thee sometime if thou doesn't look sharp." Mary skipped around all the gardens and around the orchard, resting every few minutes. At length she went to her own special walk and made up her mind to try if she could skip the whole length of it. It was a good long skip, and she began slowly. But before she had gone halfway down the path, she was so hot and breathless that she was obliged to stop. She did not mind much, because she had already counted up to 30. She stopped with a little laugh of pleasure, and there, lo and behold, was the robin swaying on a long branch of ivy. He had followed her, and he greeted her with a chirp. As Mary had skipped towards him, she felt something heavy in her pocket strike against her at each jump, and when she saw the robin, she laughed again. "You showed me where the key was yesterday," she said. "You ought to show me the door today. But I don't believe you know." The robin flew from his swinging spray of ivy onto the top of the wall, and he opened his beak and sang a loud, lovely trill, merely to show off. Nothing in the world is quite as adorably lovely as a robin when he shows off, and they are nearly always doing it. Mary Lennox had heard a great deal about magic in the stories she listened to as a child, and she always said that the next thing that happened was magic. One of the nice little gusts of wind rushed down the walk, and it was a stronger gust of wind than usual. It was strong enough to wave the branches of the trees, and it was more than strong enough to sway the trailing sprays of untrimmed ivy hanging from the wall. Mary had stepped close to the robin, and suddenly the gust of wind swung aside some loose ivy trails, and more suddenly still she jumped towards it and caught it in her hand. This she did because she had seen something under the ivy, a round knob, which had been covered by the leaves hanging over it. It was the knob of a door. She put her hands under the leaves and began to push and pull them aside. Thick as the ivy hung, it nearly all was a loose and swinging curtain, though some had crept over wood and iron. Mary's heart began to thump, and her hands to shake a little in her delight and excitement. The robin kept singing and twittering away and tilting his head on one side, and as if he were as excited as she was. What was this thing under her hands, which was square and made of iron, and which her fingers found a hole in? It was the lock of the door, which had been closed for 10 years. And she put her hand in her pocket, drew out the key, and found that it fitted in the keyhole. She put the key in and turned it. And it took 2 hands to do it, but it did turn. And then she took a long breath and looked behind her up the long walk to see if anyone was coming. No one was coming. No one ever did come, it seemed, and she took another long breath because she could not help it, and she held back the swinging curtain of ivy and pushed back the door, which opened slowly, slowly. Then she slipped through it and shut it behind her and stood with her back against it, looking about her and breathing quite fast with excitement and wonder and delight. She was standing inside the secret garden. And that is the end of chapter 8.